So recently I sold my Sony ZV-E1 and I picked up this guy right here, the Sony FX30. Now the main reason why I sold the Sony ZV-E1 to pick up the FX30 is because I needed something reliable that was going to act more like a companion to my Sony FX3 and my FX6. And so honestly, after just watching a few videos, it seems like there's no better camera than the FX30. Now obviously you can argue and say other cameras like the Sony a7 IV would also fit really well in between those two, but I already own that camera and I didn't want to use it for the jobs that I was going to be replacing the Sony ZV-E1 for. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few different tests with this camera. Now the main things that people really worry about with this camera from what I've read online before buying it is one, the low light capability because it's a crop sensor camera, and then two, the additional crops that come on top of the APS-C sensor whenever using certain video settings within this camera. Now before we jump into the test, I do want to hype this camera up and tell you guys why this is such a cool camera in the first place. So I'm sure that you guys have heard of the Sony a7 III. That was the first camera of this kind to come out, and they did so great when it came out that they literally took the same sensor and put it into a different body and called it a cinema camera, the Sony FX3. So here are some of the reasons why these two cameras sold so well on the release date. You had dual native ISO, you had 4K 120, you had HD up to 240 frames per second, you get 422 10-bit within the camera itself, and you get that at 4K and HD. You can do slow and quick settings also within the camera, and if you actually got the Sony FX3, it came with a top handle that had an XLR module on it, so this was a really good deal for someone interested in a camera like this. So after making those cameras and selling a bunch of them, they decided to come out with another camera, the Sony FX30, which is the one that we have today. Now this camera sits at a much more affordable price range for most filmmakers or videographers or even beginners to purchase. Now like I said, there are a few drawbacks when using this camera instead of something like the a7S III or the Sony FX3. The first one is the crop factor. So I believe the second dual native ISO on this camera is at 3200. So that means at 3200, you're gonna actually get a cleaner image, and then from there you can progress up and still get a cleaner image than if you were right below the 3200. Now the other base ISO is 640, I believe. It may be 800, but I believe it's 640. However, on the Sony ZV-E1, a7S III, and the Sony FX3, guys, you get a dual native ISO at 12,800 for the second one, and I believe it's at 640 or again 800 for the low one. So I wanted to bring this camera along and test out the 4K 120 to see if the crop is too much. So one of the things that a lot of people talk about not liking about this camera is the fact that it's an APS-C sensor and not a full frame, and also that it has pretty bad low light, which obviously has to do with the first thing. So right now we're shooting a real estate home with the Sony FX30 at 120 frames per second. Okay, so there were a few things that I definitely learned after shooting that home. One, you definitely, you have to take into consideration the crop factor that comes on this camera when shooting. From doing 4K 120 or just the camera itself being a crop sensor, it was way too tight. And I always shoot at 4K 120. It doesn't mean that I'll always be slowing that down to 25% in post, but I do have that flexibility of doing that. The other thing to keep in mind is that whenever you're shooting real estate homes, you want most of everything in focus. So that meant not only did I have to shoot at the dual native ISO at the top end, but I also had to open up my aperture quite a bit, which means that I'm losing so much light. Having that dual native ISO was essential when using the Sony FX30. And unfortunately, I didn't have any stabilization within the camera itself to actually throw it into catalyst browse and restabilize it. So what you shoot in camera is what you're going to get if you're shooting at those high frame rates when using the FX30. Okay, so other than the shots looking way too tight, It was quite a bit noisy. And the thing is that it wasn't just noisy within the low light areas. The whole video was very, very noisy. Now, if you guys are watching on your smartphone, I'm not sure how much of this is coming across, but on my computer right back here, this huge screen, I actually have a shot pulled up now. It's pretty dang noisy, especially in comparison to shooting with something like the Sony a7S III, the Sony FX30, or typically I shoot with the Sony a7 IV. So I'll make that comparison because typically that's why I shoot real estate homes with the Sony a7 IV, and I'm typically shooting it at 60 frames per second because that's as high as it can go unless you want to go into HD. And I will say that I was very surprised that it did look that noisy even outside. That's just something I wasn't expecting. Low light, yes, but just overall, the whole image, no matter what you're shooting, being more noisy, did not expect that at all. However, even though it sounds like I'm complaining, I'm not. I understand that this is a crop sensor camera, so you're going to have more noise in the image. I'm just saying I wasn't expecting that much. Okay, so next I went out and I just tested the camera in general to see how it will perform. I also tested the RAW capabilities coming out of this camera into the Ninja V. So I did shoot ProRes RAW at the same time I was shooting internally in the camera. So let's go ahead and check out those shots and see how they turned out. We are outside right now. We have Asher, we have his fan. We are temperature controlling our baby, or we're trying to do the best we can. And we're also in the shade. We're about to test out the Sony FX30, see what shots we can get as we're walking on the cool path.
Feeling like I'm breathing my last breath. Feeling like I'm walking my last steps. Look at all of these tears I've wept. Look at all the promises that I've kept. I put my all into your hands. Here's my soul to keep. I let you in with all that I can. You're not hard to reach. And you blessed me with the best gift that I've ever known. You give me purpose. Yeah, you've given me purpose. Thinking my journey's come to an end. Sending out a farewell to my friends. Far in a peace. Ask you to forgive me for my sins. Oh, would you please? I'm more than grateful for the time we spent. My spirit's at ease. I put my heart into your hands. Learn the lessons you teach. No matter when, wherever I am, you're not hard to reach.
Okay, so the settings that I used for that shoot, I was shooting at the base ISO, the dual native ISO. I typically only shoot at one of those two. I don't really shoot anywhere in the middle because I want the best image coming out of this camera. So I was at 640, I believe, is the native ISO, the lowest one on this camera. And I shot at 30 frames per second. So I wasn't shooting any crazy high frame rates. Even though this video is going through YouTube's compression, I'm pretty sure that you guys can see a massive difference in between the files that came out of this camera and the files that came out of the Ninja V, the ProRes RAW files. There was just so much more color, more depth in those ProRes RAW images, and honestly, I was very surprised. Even after doing multiple tests like this before, the image just looks so good coming out of the Ninja V with not actually having to do a lot to the settings themselves. And you're also getting a wider range of colors that come through RAW than shooting in camera itself. Overall, I was really happy with how the images came out that were in camera. I think that for the price of this camera to be able to get images that look like that, that's amazing, and I'm really happy that I could rely on this camera in those hot temperatures to do that. Now, if I was out there shooting with the Sony ZV-E1, which I have done in that same location, the camera would have overheated. It was really hot out there. Even though I was in the shade, it would have overheated. I'm telling you this because I literally shot in that same location in the shade, and the camera overheated after 2 or 3 shots. And so being able to have something that's really, really reliable and rugged is really nice. Okay, so now one last test that I actually did with this camera, which really, again, all of these really weren't tests. Maybe the last one was a test because I didn't get paid for it. But these other two, the real estate and this one that I'm about to talk about, which is podcast, these were both paid gigs. So I just happened to be filming some of the camera on those gigs. So I've been shooting the LOL podcast since the beginning of it starting. And so whenever I bought the Sony ZV-E1, I had replaced it with the Sony ZV-E10. And so I would set up in there and I was shooting with it. And honestly, guys, I had no issues out of the Sony ZV-E10. But whenever I replaced that camera on set for the podcast with the Sony ZV-E1, it overheated like crazy. I would have to, in between podcasts, because we would batch record them, go put the Sony ZV-E1 in the fridge and then take it back out, and it would still overheat. And I would leave it in the fridge for about 15 minutes. I know that sounds crazy. Maybe I shouldn't do that. I don't know. I was just trying to get it to cool down really quick. So I sold that camera because I just got tired of wasting time on set trying to cool down the camera. And I bought this one. Now, for you guys screaming at me in the comments below saying you're not supposed to be shooting content like that with the Sony ZV-E1, it's not what it's for. I kind of agree with you, but also I did figure out a hack to fix that in my last video with the Sony ZV-E1, and I was able to get so much more longer record times. And so if you guys are interested in that, if you have the Sony ZV-E1, go over and check out that video. You'll see what I'm talking about. But moving back over to the Sony FX30, obviously no issues at all. If anything, I would just say be mindful that you do have the crop factor. And so me going from crop sensor to full frame back to a crop, I did have to remember that the camera can't go in the same place as before with the Sony ZV-E1 because I have to account for the crop factor, which means that you have to bring different lenses sometime. And luckily I had brought different lenses, but the first time I set up, it was way too tight. So having a Sony FX30 for podcasts, honestly, I think that is the best use case for this camera. A camera that just sits up in a room and you're just recording in one place. You're able to get really good images out of this camera. Now, the other reason why I think this is perfect for podcasting is because you do have those two XLR mounts on the camera itself. I'm actually recording right into my Sony FX3's XLR mount right now. So if you guys are curious of what type of audio quality you can get out of the handle coming off of this Sony FX30, then you're basically listening to it, because literally I'm using the XLR module off the Sony FX30 right now. I just have it connected to the Sony FX3 and I'm recording right in with the pod mic from Rode. So here are my final thoughts. If you're a content creator and you're looking for a camera, it's really hard for me to say that you should get the Sony FX30 over the Sony ZV-E1, because I really did love the Sony ZV-E1. And I will say, I definitely got way better images out of the Sony ZV-E1, much easier, and just honestly in general, than I can with the Sony FX30. Full frame just has a completely different look to it. And obviously with a crop sensor, you're going to just have more noise in the image in general. But if you're someone who knows you're going to be doing podcasts as a content creator, which is why I say, people fuss and say you shouldn't be using the Sony ZV-E1 for podcasting. Well, if you're a content creator, you're probably going to be doing a podcast, especially in 2023. So anyways. So I think that if you're going to be doing podcasts, however, I would really consider something like the Sony FX30 instead of the Sony ZV-E1. Or if you're going to be recording any type of interviews, especially if you're going to be recording outside a lot, I would recommend this camera over that one. But it really is hard to say because all cameras are so good nowadays. If you buy any of the cameras that I mentioned today, you're going to be getting really good images, especially whenever you go through the compression of social media or of YouTube and you're getting it online in people's faces. Guys, those screens are so small, which is where most people are consuming content. So you really can't go wrong nowadays whenever you're choosing a camera. All right, so if you guys are curious as far as how I actually edited any of the images that I got today, whether it's the ProRes RAW or whether it's just the footage in general, how I color graded it in DaVinci Resolve, I would love to make a video like that, but I'm only going to be doing something like that if you guys are requesting it. So if you guys will let me know in the comment section below what type of content you would like to see surrounded around the FX30, the Sony FX3, the FX6, I have the Sony a7 IV. I can make tutorials or videos for you and help you guys out. Just let me know in the comment section below. But until next time, definitely check out my last video with the Sony ZV-E1.